We're going to start from scratch in Blender 2.8, but since this is a realistic project, I'm going to first immerse myself in photographic reference. That way I can better understand exactly what I'm trying to create, as well as start to formulate a game plan for how to approach it. Now I will jump over to my web browser, and I have started to favor a site called unsplash.com. It's full of royalty-free public domain imagery that's at the quality of stock photography. So for example, if we search sand dunes, we get nearly 19,000 photos. And these are all high quality photographer photos, meaning they're not taken with somebody's iPhone who happens to be in a desert. These are artistic, high quality images. And that's great for us in reference because maybe some of that artistry will rub off onto us as we create this project and any other project that I use Unsplash for. So yeah, this resource is great. I highly recommend it. And as we scroll down, we can see a ton of photos that will be useful for this project. And I think I mentioned, but they are royalty free, which is amazing. So I've downloaded several and I've put them all into a collage image. That way I can open them together inside of Blender. So that's what I want to do next. Split my viewport down here, and in the bottom, I'm going to choose an image editor, open that image. Now to maximize this image, control spacebar, and we can take a look at the images I'm going to use for reference. So if we start, let's say down here at the bottom left, the reason I like this image is it's kind of an aerial view, and so we see a larger pattern to the sand dunes than we see anywhere else in these closer angles. However, for the final product, I will be closer in perspective. I want it to look like someone standing on the dunes taking a picture of the surrounding landscape, which looks like the rest of the images except this one, which is, a closer view of the sand surface with this nice ripply texture. And so with this collage, I'm trying to capture the broad spectrum of information I will need to create this project. And ideally, it will answer all of my questions along the way. But the final result will be something probably in perspective, it will look like this bottom right image, but in color and tone, I think I want something either that matches the upper right or the far left image. Those are my favorite in terms of composition and atmosphere and colors. So yeah, as I look through these images, I'm going to think about the project to come and how it's going to be constructed. First of all is the shape or the modeling, so to speak. I say that because we're not actually going to be polygon modeling this. We're going to be doing it with a shader, but still we're going to be generating geometric shapes. And when I look at these dunes, the main thing that I see is a kind of mountain range shape, right? So it's several dunes kind of patterned together, and it looks like a low-key mountain range, but it's much smoother than a mountain surface. And also the ridges are very tight, very sharp, but also more curvy. I assume due to the wind blowing this sand over time. As you can see in this image, it's clearly blowing the sand. But yeah, that's the main feature. Like the 95% of the shape is in that smoothed out curvy mountain range. And then if we zoom in, the second layer involves finer details in this wave shape. And you see this wave pattern kind of appear in various places along the surface. Like it's isolated right here, but then it smooths out around this kind of path coloration, and then it appears on the left side. So we're going to want to emulate that and have this pattern appear in various places. And as I look around, just trying to see if they're missing anything else, we're going to be zoomed out enough to where I don't think we'll need individual sand grains. Yeah, as far as the shape, it's going to be a two-layer approach, main shape, and then fine details. And that's what I want to create in this first lesson. So now that we've analyzed the reference, I can de-maximize the image editor. And now I need to think about setting up my scene. So I've already mentioned that this isn't going to be a traditional polygon modeling approach, meaning I'm not going to dive into the mesh and start pushing and pulling verts. That would be nice in that there's no additional setup. I can just start working right away. But since we're doing this with shaders, I have a checklist of things I need to set up initially. And that includes base geometry plus any modifiers that go with it, a render preview window, lighting for the scene or an HDRI environment to make it easy, a camera, as well as some render settings. So before we can really even proceed with the creation, we need those things set up out of the gate. So first, for the geometry, I'm going to delete our default cube and the light as well, and instead add a mesh plane. This is going to represent our terrain, and we're going to generate or displace all of our geometry from this single plane. I do want it to be big. We're creating a landscape, so I want this thing to be large and representative of that. So I'm going to tab into edit mode and simply scale up by 100. I'm not so concerned about what kind of square acreage this is exactly. I just know I want it to be big, and the only reference I'm really using is the size of the camera. To me, this looks an appropriate size for the camera compared to our landscape, and that's good enough for me. And note that I did do that in edit mode so that I maintain our normal scale values of 1. If those values are not 1, it can do funky things in the shader that you're not expecting. So while I'm in edit mode though, let me go ahead and cut more edge loops so that we have a higher resolution of geometry in the base mesh. All right, I'm going to right click and choose subdivide. Now I'm going to get rid of the tool panel by hitting T, reveal our subdivide options, and we can slide up the number of cuts, but it stops at 10. However, we can type in a different value above 10, so I'm going to say 40. And the purpose of this is just to have more geometry on the base mesh because we are going to be displacing the geometry and we'll need a lot of polygons in order to make that believable. And starting from one single face is not ideal for that situation. So I've subdivided the base mesh. It's still pretty simple overall, but now I can set up modifiers, namely a subdivision surface modifier. This will give us enough geometry to be able to displace all of the detail that we see in our reference image. But specifically, there's a setting called adaptive subdivision or micro displacement that's not available by default. So this is where we need to set up a render setting. If I go to our render panel, we are not going to be using Eevee because this setting is only available in cycles. So let's switch over to cycles and change the feature set to experimental. Now when I go back to the modifier panel, we have this adaptive setting. And essentially this gives us enough geometry to compensate for all the detail that we need, dependent on the distance from the camera. So practically speaking, if this was a render, let's say this image down here, let me maximize that. If this was a render, then the front dune right here would have the maximum amount of geometry to compensate for all of that detail. But then on the back, the geometry would be simplified according to the pixel density. So the geometry back here does not need as many polygons to compensate for the detail as we do up front. And that's what adaptive subdivision does, and it's very powerful for creating highly detailed meshes. And so upon rendering, I will want to enable adaptive and probably leave it at the default dicing rate of 1. All right, so that's our base geometry and the modifiers set up. Next, we need a render preview window. I'm going to drag this up from the bottom right, switch this over to the 3D viewport, and turn off our overlays. And essentially, this will just be what we use to render and visualize the changes we make in our shader. Keeping it small like this will be nice to optimize our computer performance. And I can hit 0 while hovering over that viewport to look into our camera that we left available. And then if I hit the N key to reveal our view properties, I can enable lock to camera, and we immediately see a problem. It's a clipping plane issue. Since we have such a big plane, we need to change the default clip value for our camera. So I'm going to select that, select the camera, and change, clip end from 100 meters to 1,000 meters. Now we should be able to see the entire plane. Excellent. All right, so for now, the camera is just going to be kind of like a bird flying around our scene at whatever angle we need. But once we have geometry set up, then we can establish a more permanent position for the camera. And the other thing that we need is lighting in the scene, because if I hit Z and hold that down and then click rendered, first you're going to see that updating mesh is happening, and that's due to the adaptive subdivision. So this is a little bit quirky in my opinion. If we click on the plane and go back to our modifiers, the adaptive subdivision does function in the viewport, which can be nice, but you'll see throughout this course that I'm constantly wishing that the adaptive only happened for a real render. In other words, what I want to do functionally is have my viewport levels of subdivision be set to 4, very high, but not as high or as intensive as adaptive subdivision. That way I can see a preview at standard subdivision of 4, and then when I do an actual full res render, I wish that it would enable adaptive. And so you're going to see me turn that on and off, preferably off for the viewport rendering and then on for an actual render. But it is an experimental setting. Maybe that will be updated. We will have to see, but it is going to be much faster to just use our 4 levels of subdivision in the viewport. And now that I'm rendering, it's just a gray plain scene. This is where we need lighting. And since it is an outdoor scene, there's very little reason to use actual lamp objects. Instead, we can get a lot more bang for our buck and simpler setup if we just use an HDRI environment. So if we go to the World tab and click Use Nodes, I can change the color swatch for an environment texture. We'll see the scene go pink. This means it's ready to accept an environment texture, preferably HDRI. And as for HDRIs, if I switch back to our browser window, I highly recommend HDRIhaven.com. Again, these are all CC0, 100% free, and they're very high quality. I recommend that you consider supporting Greg Zoll on Patreon because it's extremely generous that he offers these for free. Now, if we click on HDRIs up here, we are looking for an outdoor scene. If I click on all of them, I actually really like the first one, Sprue at Sunrise. That's one I used for the research and development of this project. And it will not matter that it's not a desert scene. What I like the most about this is the color and temperature that it brings to the lighting. So I'm going to download that, just a 1K, pretty low resolution, but we'll download that one. And of course, you're welcome to use whatever you want, whatever time of day you want. Just keep in mind that you probably don't want to go with something like this because the trees will show up in the render. And you certainly don't want an indoor one for obvious reasons. But anything with an open sky and a sun will be fine. So we've downloaded our HDRI and we are ready to plug that in. I'll click the open button and I have that already loaded into my library of textures. Let me go find that. Here we go, Sprue at Sunrise 1K. Excellent, now we've got lighting in the scene and we'll be able to understand our shape better as we create it. So we've got all those items on the checklist. Now we're ready to actually start displacing our geometry with a shader. And anytime I create a procedural project like this that's based on material generation, I do have to jump through these hoops because otherwise we won't be able to know what's going on with our material. So let's switch our main viewport now to, well, not the preferences, we want the shader editor, and make sure that my plane is selected and hit new to create that new material. And if you've watched any of my shader tutorials before, you know that I'm a big fan of Voronoi because it's got a lot of applications, and this is another application for the Shift-A texture, Voronoi texture. Now I'm going to Shift-Control-Click on that because I have the Node Wrangler tool enabled. If you do not see that happen when you hit Shift-Control-Click, then go to your add-ons in your user preferences, so Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and find Node Wrangler and enable that. At this point, there's really no reason you shouldn't have that enabled if you find yourself in the shader editor much. All right, so by Shift-Control-Clicking, we see the pure color output of our texture. And this is going to get us pretty close to the sand dunes. However, we need to plug it into displacement. So if we plug that color value, or let's use the factor actually, that's just the black and white data, plug it into the displacement material output, we don't actually see anything happen. If I Shift-Control-Click on the principal BSDF and maybe switch our base color to something more like sand, turn off specular, there we go, something more like that, we can see that the Voronoi texture is not actually displacing the geometry, it's just serving as bump data. And I want to switch this to be displacement. So the way we do that is in the material properties, let's go ahead and rename the material Sand Dunes. I'm going to scroll down until we get to, actually not the displacement settings, which maybe makes a little more sense for it to exist there, but in the regular settings, under displacement method, it's set to bump only by default. We want to set it to displacement only by default. Now, if you're looking really closely, you might have noticed that the plane did slightly shift. It's no longer perfectly flat. So the displacement is working, but it's nowhere near strong enough. So in order to bump the strength up, we can add a converter math node and simply multiply this value by whatever we want. If we want it 10 times the strength, let's just type in 10. And now we're starting to see displacement in the shader. And it's already looking kind of similar to sand dunes. So this is a great start. However, it is too uniform and it's also too straight. If we look from above especially, you can see that the ridges are particularly straight in how they connect throughout the pattern. Whereas if we look at our reference, there's a distinct curvature to the way the sand dunes are formed. And that takes us to texture coordinate manipulation because we don't have any settings in the Voronoi that will curve the ridges. It's really just simple. It's the scale value where we can make the dunes look bigger or we can make them look smaller. But I like the default of 5 for now. Instead, we need to manipulate the texture coordinates. So again, thanks to the Node Wrangler add-on, I can select the Voronoi texture and hit Control-T, and that will provide us a texture coordinate node and a mapping node. And what you need to know about texture coordinates is that it's 3D data for mapping a texture to a model. And we can manipulate these texture coordinates with this mapping node by, say, moving it in the X location. Just like you would move something in 3D space, we can move a texture in 3D space. Both location, we can rotate the texture, which practically kind of looks like the sand dunes are shifting over time, which, has its interesting applications. We can also scale, which kind of serves a very similar function to the scale value here, except we have it in unique individual axes. So all I want you to take from this mapping node is that the textural coordinates can be manipulated. But this is too simplistic for how we want to manipulate. I rather want a noise texture plugged in to move around those textural coordinates with variety. All right, so I'm going to hit Control-X to remove the mapping node and instead add a color mix RGB node. So it kind of blew my mind when I figured this out from Bartek Skropa, who used this technique in the Wood Shader Forge lesson. The fact that texture coordinate vector data can come into a color node and function. And we can actually use color to manipulate the coordinates. So for example, if I take color 2 here and we change the red, green, and blue value, let's take blue and green all the way down and increase red. Now as I increase that, you'll see that the texture seems to be moving in a particular axis. And the red channel correlates to the x-axis, green channel to the y-axis, blue channel to the z-axis. All right, but this is still one value affecting the entire coordinates of our texture. We only want to affect in certain places, and this is where the noise texture comes in. So texture, noise texture, if we look at that by shift control clicking, you can see that there's a variety of colors in this general breakup pattern. So now as we plug that directly into color 2, it should give us a variety in the sand dunes pattern. So let's take a look at that. Shift clicking on the principled BSDF, and yes, right away we see a much more curvy nature to the ridges in our dunes. It's also broken up at a much finer level. So we have some options for adjusting this. We have the factor, which if we bump that up, we're going to get a more intense result. If we go way down, it's going to be much more simplistic. And if we go all the way down, we get the regular Voronoi. So if we step this up very slowly, like 0.1, you can see that we gradually start to introduce curvature and noise to the texture coordinates. So I think like something 0.1, 0.2 is actually pretty nice. Maybe 0.1 for now. At this point, we also need to start deciding where is our camera going to be placed, because if I want it to look, want the final render to look something like this, then I need to place the camera appropriately, something closer to the surface. Yeah, something like this. That's actually looking pretty cool. But keep in mind that you have a lot of options for adjusting the look. Like we can increase the height of our dunes by increasing this multiply value, let's say 15. Now our dunes get a little bit higher. Maybe we can circle around, find a better spot. This is actually kind of a fun part, being able to quickly navigate around the scene like so. Let's leave it here for now. We can also adjust things in the noise texture, like the scale, for example. If we go up to 10, we're going to get a finer breakup, which I don't think really works in this scenario. It starts to make it look more like a rocky surface. So maybe keep that at 5. And detail, we can also crank that up to like 10, which adds finer detail, but at a smaller impact, I would say. So I kind of like this angle. Let's go ahead and leave the camera where it is by unchecking lock camera to view. And then I can still freely rotate around the scene and kind of get a bird's eye view of what's going on. Now the detail level at 10, hopefully you can see how it changes the effect. If we turn that back down to 2, scale up to 10, you can see it's very distinctly different. So I like the scale at 5 and the detail, I don't know about 10. That seems maybe a little bit too high. It does start to look a little bit like a rocky surface, but maybe, how about 5, kind of split the difference? Even still, you know what might be something to do, if we look at the camera, how is that looking? Because ultimately that is what matters the most. You know, we kind of get an effect similar to what we see in our reference. Maybe that's still too fine. What about like 3? Yeah, something like that, perhaps. But then we also have this distortion setting, which if we zoom out and enable that, this also increases the kind of curvature, the curviness of what's happening in the dunes. Very, very interesting results. But still, it can quickly start to approach a rocky-like surface. So maybe dial that down to like, I forgot what the default was, maybe 1, actually 0 is maybe the default. Yeah, so if we put that up to 1, we can start to get some interesting appearance to the surface. I also might want to change the lighting at this point. I think too much of our dunes are in shadow, so we can switch quickly over to the world setting and use the same hotkey Control-T to plug up a texture coordinate and mapping node. And here we will use the mapping node to simply rotate our world in the Z-axis, so the up and down axis, basically spinning it like a top. Let's try 90 degrees, or just move it around ourselves by sliding until we get a more interesting appearance, kind of shadow play. Maybe something like this. All of these things we'll be tweaking along the way until we get to the final result. But at this point, I've got the right pieces in the puzzle to make up the majority shape of our displaced sand dunes. In the next lesson, we're going to look at adding finer detail where we want it on the dunes, namely that wavy kind of pattern that we see here. Maybe not quite this fine, but look through all of our images and find a nice compromise that looks good. But it's pretty cool how much we've done with so few nodes. If we go back to our object material, we're off to a really good start, and we'll continue the project in the next video. In order to continue with the refinement process, I need to lock down my camera, because currently every setting that I touch, say this Voronoi scale from 5 to 4, will produce drastically different results in the viewport. Now, up until this point, it's been great because it means the shader is extremely flexible and we can get an endless variety of sand dune shapes. But for refining, I need to land on a certain camera angle and a certain sand dune shape to filter the refinement down into the exact direction I want to go. And so this will be a combination of, changing these settings a little bit, rotating the ground plane, rotating the world, until we get something that we like. So this is more or less playtime, and then we get serious. So let's see, since the scale value from 5 to 4 was so drastic, what about 4.5? Kind of cut the difference. Then what about the noise texture? Like the distortion, what about from 1 to 2? Well, that's pretty drastic. What about 1.5? Maybe the detail is a little bit too high frequency. How about change that to 2? Okay, that's enough changing the shader settings. What about rotating our ground plane? Yeah, we can start to get more interesting shapes as we rotate. Oh, I'm kind of liking this. I like the way this ridge approaches the front of the camera. What if we move our plane a little bit? Yeah, I think that looks pretty cool, actually. What about our world? If I rotate that, yeah, I think that's a little bit more dramatic of an angle, so the shadow play is a little more interesting. And another thing that I like to do is get rid of this half opaque space around the plane. So if I select my camera, go down to camera properties, viewport display, under passer par 2, I like to crank that all the way up to 1. Now I only see what the camera will see. I tend to get distracted by what I see outside the frame, and I'm not exactly sure what the camera will render. So this helps out. And yeah, I think the composition of the frame is much more interesting. Make sure that my lock camera to view is turned off. It is. So now this is essentially locked. I won't be changing the camera anymore. And we can start the refinement process. So if I select the plane, go back to our object material properties. The first thing I want to try is a generic noise. Because if we zoom in on this image, you can see that we've got some waviness, but a little bit more of a broad, flowy type pattern. Whereas, if we look down here, that's more of that sharp, distinct wavy pattern that we see in other images as well. Well, it's zoomed in really close right here, but also down in this image, it's very, very distinct. So now that I'm at this stage, I am kind of seeing the second layer of geometric detail being twofold. A generic noise pattern that emphasizes the flow of the sand. We can kind of see that happening in here as well. And then a more distinct wave pattern on top. So we'll start with the noise texture. I'm going to grab this noise texture, Shift D, duplicate it across, and we will use the same manipulated vector texture coordinate data, plug that into the noise texture, and now let's take a look, Shift Control clicking on it, then go to the factor, and I think I want the pattern to be higher frequency, so the scale of 20. Yeah, and you can kind of see that the variety of these values is going to produce some sort of a wavy, flowy pattern. Now for the detail, I'm thinking that needs to be up as well. Let's see, from 2 to 5. Yeah, I think that looks good. Leave distortion where it is, and let's mix this in now with a color mix RGB node. I want to mix it over top of the Voronoi subtly, because remember, this Voronoi is the main shape of the dunes. So mixing it in subtly with this noise texture, we will be adjusting the displacement. So we'll plug that in and then use the factor. We're going to change the mix to overlay. And even though the overlay, the mixture type, I don't think is that important, I do like overlay because, in my opinion, they kind of blend the two mixtures together a little bit better. Whereas if it's a straight mixture, sometimes they can fight each other. You know, in this case, we're taking equal parts of one and mixing it with equal parts of the other. And sometimes those just don't, I guess blend is the word that I'm trying to think of. Whereas when I make it an overlay or a soft light, the values just, I don't know, interweave in a more cohesive way. That's why I use overlay. And I know that's not very scientific or mathematic, but ultimately I think we're artists, so I'm okay with that. And as far as the value, I think it's going to be way too strong. Yeah, so 0.5 is crazy strong. Let's go to 0.1. And you can start to see this wavy pattern, this flowy pattern. Sorry, I'm going to be using those words. I'm going to call this one a flowy noise breakup. And then the wave pattern will be next. So flowy, flowy. This is the flowy pattern. And 0.1, that might be a good value. All right, let's do an actual render. We're getting to that stage where the preview has served its purpose and we need to start doing true renders to see what our detail level is going to be like. Because remember, we're not using adaptive in the preview, but we do want it for the render, and that will look slightly different. So I'm going to pause the preview render and enable adaptive, because if I enable adaptive while the preview is going, it will calculate the geometry based on adaptive, and that can take upwards of 15 to 20 seconds, so it's a definite buzzkill when you're in the zone as far as shading and rendering. So now that adaptive is enabled, I can do a render, although I've got some settings first. Instead of 1920 by 1080, we'll make it 50% of that resolution. And what else? I think that's it for the output. As far as render settings, I will be using denoising. Since it's a still frame, you know, it's kind of standard to use denoising at this point. So I can decrease the render samples to 64. And then let's enable denoising over here in the render layer or view layers panel, whatever this is called, now in 2.8. Back to the render settings themselves. I do like to change performance tiling to 32 by 32. I feel like it's a hair faster than 64 by 64. But they're actually probably very comparable. If for nothing else, I like to see smaller tiles build up. I feel like that's what makes it seem faster. But anyway, I think that's all the render settings. Let's render that image. Okay, now we can start to see what this flow pattern really means. Because it is a generic noise, but it has a distinct flow. You can see the curvature kind of wrapping around our dunes because they're using the same manipulated texture coordinates. So those work really well together. I think it's perhaps a little bit too strong because it does start to feel more like a rocky surface, but this is a good component to have. I'm pretty happy with this. Now for that second layer, let's try to implement this fine wave pattern. All right, so we've covered flowy, now we're going on to wave. And I'm going to do that actually with a Voronoi texture. So Shift Control, duplicating this Voronoi texture, our main Voronoi texture, and we can change the scale to be much, much higher. Like, well, before I change that, let's actually see it happen in the viewport. So I need to disable adaptive, re-enable our viewport rendering, and let's Shift Control click on this Voronoi. We want it to be the same kind of pattern, you know, but we need it to be much smaller and we need to stretch it out. So for the smaller factor, let's go to like 200, maybe even 300. And in order to stretch it out, we're going to use a mapping node. So Shift A, vector mapping, plug that in right there. Maybe rearrange our nodes a little bit. Make some more room. And for the mapping, we can simply scale the X value to 0.1, and that will stretch out our pattern. You can also try the Y direction, 0.1 in Y, and that will stretch it more front to back in the scene. So either way, you know, it's kind of up to you. I think I'm going to roll with the X direction. To me, that kind of emphasizes the swooping larger dunes, but you know, I might switch to the Y. We'll see. The beauty of this approach is, of course, the flexibility. So now I want to mix this with the noise texture that we created a few minutes ago. Shift A, color, mix RGB. In this too, I want to be a overlay for the same reason. I just want the textures to blend together a little bit more naturally. And as far as the mixture value itself, you can start to get an idea of what this will look like. But you can tell that the Veranoid texture is way too strong. We see the really, really noticeable peaks and scallops. So let's take that down to like 0.1, maybe 0.2. There we go. It seems to be a little bit better. Look at the preview. Still, I think it might be too strong. How about a mixture of 0.05? Yeah, that might be a little bit better. Let's take a look at the render. View my render and switch to slot number 2. Pause the viewport, enable adaptive, and render again. Okay, now that's looking pretty good. We have a nice level of detail, which for realism, you know, we need a high level of detail, and I think we're achieving that now. The only problem with it is since it's spread so uniformly across the surface of the dunes, it does feel a little bit like a rocky surface, whereas in our reference, we do have distinct areas with that high fidelity detail, but then we also have large portions that are completely smooth, and that's characteristic of sand dunes. Let's maximize this so we can see what I'm talking about. Take this image, for example. Right here, the detail is very strong, but very, very isolated. We also have it here in the shadow. Up here, we have it as well, but it's more subtle. And, you know, a large portion of the dunes is completely smooth. So I need to isolate the detail we've just created to only certain areas. Now, from what I can tell, the pattern is kind of random, or at least for our purposes, I think a random noise pattern will be fine. So let's turn off adaptive and re-enable the viewport. And I'm going to use a noise texture. I don't think it really necessarily matters that we use the manipulated coordinates. It'll be fine just as is, using default coordinates. And let's Shift-Control-Click on the factor to see what that's like. How about the scale we take down to like 5? Okay, so this is going to be the splotchy type random pattern that I want, but the values right now are too gray. I need more black and white because black will mean no pattern and white will mean full pattern. And by pattern, I mean this fine detail pattern. So in order to adjust the contrast, I'm going to add a color brightness and contrast node. And let's bump up the contrast. There we go, something like this. And then the scale, let's see. Let's leave that where it's at right now, but take the brightness down because there's too much white and I want there to be a little bit more black. There we go, something like this. Okay, I think that's somewhere to start. Now, I'm going to plug this into the overlay factor, which has the highest mixture value of 0.05. So I need to convert these values so that what was white is going to be 0.05. So Shift A, converter math node, we can multiply that by that value 0.05. Though looking at the brightness and contrast, I don't really see much white anymore, so maybe I can make that 0.1 just a little bit stronger. We'll have to dial that in, I suppose. But if my brightness and contrast had a white value, then I would simply type 0.05, multiply it by 0.05. All right, let's take a look at that result. We don't see much in the viewport. So let's go ahead and bump up the value. How about 0.2? 0.3. All right, now we're starting to see that value, but we can't really trust the preview. There's not enough subdivision, so let's pause the viewport, check adaptive, view our render, and switch to slot 3. Let's render that. Excellent. Now we're getting the best of both worlds. We get the smoothness, the representative of sand, and then we also get that wind-blown wave pattern in certain areas. There's one more thing I want to do to the shader, and that is to add a kind of softness to the sand itself. And this is a technique using Fresnel that I also use for cloth to make fabric shader feel soft as well. So we'll switch to slot 4 in preparation for a new render. And what it is simply using an input Fresnel node, and I'm going to mix it in with our base color. So let's add a color mix RGB node. Now let's take a look at the Fresnel by itself. First, disable adaptive, re-enable the preview window. And yeah, I've talked about Fresnel so much, you should know what it is. But in case you don't, all it does is add a brighter value to the grazing angles. So the angles of the surface that are facing more perpendicularly to the camera versus surface that face parallel to the camera or directly at the camera. Those are darker. And so practically what it does is it can soften a surface whenever we add it as a mixture. So let me just simply copy this color over. And we can do an addition, though what about an overlay too? That's kind of interesting. Maybe decrease the saturation, drop down the value a bit. Plug that into our base color, see what that looks like. Okay, yeah, now we can start to see more detail in the shadowed areas. So if we disconnect this, you can see, well, for one, the color is different. Let's transfer that new color. So let's go back to before. You can see here that there's surface information in the shadowed areas, but when we disconnect it, there's hardly any in the shadowed areas. So this is twofold. It softens the overall surface for one, and it also emphasizes the additional geometric detail. So it's two birds for one stone in this situation. And now we should be able to do a render and pretty much be finished with the shader. Whoops, I clicked render without enabling adaptive, so you can see it's very pixelated. Which, by the way, this is definitely not 4 levels of subdivision. So I don't know where it's getting this lower resolution from. But anyway, let's pause the viewport, enable adaptive, render image. And boom goes the dynamite. I'm happy with this. I'm happy calling the shader finished. In the next video, we will wrap up the project nicely. I will alter the sky, make that look a little better, and do a little bit of touch up in the compositor, and then we will be finished. In order to wrap up this project, the first thing I want to address is the sky. Because remember, we're not using a desert HDRI. It's actually an open green field, which obviously doesn't fit with the context, and we can see part of that green field. So I'm at this crossroads where I really like the lighting that the HDRI delivers to the scene, but I don't like the way it's being visualized as the sky. So I have a little trick to remedy that. Now, what I want the sky to look like is very similar to these images, meaning a cloudless sky. This one is the perfect example. I want it to be a very simple gradient from a bright light blue to a slightly darker blue. And that is in our HDRI, but currently it's not oriented properly. So for that trick, let's disable adaptive, re-enable our viewport render. And I'm going to switch to my world shader settings. And remember that we use our mapping node to rotate our world around. I'm going to select the mapping, our HDRI texture, and the background node, Shift-Control-D to duplicate them down, essentially meaning we now have 2 versions of our HDRI, and then I'm going to mix them with a shader mix shader node. And I want to now use an input light path node to trick our render. So what we'll do is use this isCameraRay, plug it into the mix shader. Now what this is doing is saying that our scene will maintain the lighting from our original HDRI version. However, we have a new version that's only going to be seen in the camera that we can manipulate. It's not going to adjust the lighting in the scene. So if I rotate this around, you'll see that the world rotates, but the lighting stays exactly the same. And this is good for us because we can simply rotate in X until we start to see the sky. And I need to go a little bit higher because we do have some power lines visible. So maybe, depending on your Z-axis rotation, you might need to rotate the Y and the X. There we go. Now we can see this gradient from lighter blue to a darker blue, but compared to our reference, it needs to be a little bit stronger. So how about I take the strength up to 2? Now we're starting to get into that proper color range, comparing it to our reference. I think I actually like 2 better. Okay, cool. So the sky is taken care of. Now the only other 3D thing I need to do is introduce a little bit of depth of field. Now, I think the slightest bit of depth of field makes it feel more photographic because photos never take a completely clear image from the back of the scene to the front of the scene. So I do want to introduce a little bit. I'll switch our main viewport here to the 3D view. And where is our camera? Camera's over here. So this should be simple enough. I think I can use the plane origin point as the focus of our camera. So we'll switch over to the camera's properties, focus object, just pick our plane. All right, so it's basically going to focus on the center of this terrain. And then we'll change the radius up to 1 meter because it's going to be a lot of depth of field. So now we can see the quality of the depth of field and that it is working. Though, I don't know, now that I'm looking at the preview, it seems to focus a little bit further back than what I want. Obviously, the blur right now is too strong, but I like to exaggerate it initially to be able to see the focus. And maybe that's not going to work for the focus object. So let's remove that. And I want to change the distance manually, which I can try to do in the viewport, just looking. But also it helps to see the actual focus cursor, which if we go to our viewport display and enable limits, that little yellow crosshair is the focus. So now we can kind of move that forward somewhere like this, perhaps. Let's take a look. Maybe a little bit further. All right, now it seems to be focusing more in the center of our terrain, which is what I want. And as far as the aperture radius, let's take that down to 0.1. And we can't really even tell that anything's blurred in the viewport, but that should be fine. I think we will see a little bit in the final render. Let's test it out. I pause my viewport render and enable adaptive, and let's render that image. There we go. If we look close, there is definitely some blur, but it's very subtle, both in the front and the back. And that's great. That's what we want. We want it to look photographic. And when you're photographing a large scene, there's much less depth of field than when you're photographing a close scene, or a close object rather. So we've got some subtle depth of field. I think the rendering part is done. Now we just need to take it into the compositor, add a little bit of treatment, and then we'll be done. So switch our main view to the compositing editor now, I guess is what that's called. And we will enable use nodes. We have our 3D render there. And the first thing I'm going to do is emphasize the sky gradient, or the light position in our scene. So our sun, based on the shadows and the sky as well, we know that our sun is in the back left corner of our scene. And so I'm going to emphasize that using a matte ellipse mask. Okay, so the ellipse mask, what it does is, I want to see a backdrop. Let me enable that right up here at the top. So an ellipse mask is just a black and white circle. I can position this over to the left, scale the height up and the width actually. Something like this, maybe move it up in Y. There we go. Now I want to blur this significantly with fast Gaussian. And let's just change the X and Y to 200. And now we have the multiplier down here at the bottom. If we go to 2, maybe 3. Okay, now we've got a nice gradient from the upper left corner being white and then black in the bottom right corner. Now we can mix this with a color mix node. And let's see, I'm thinking an overlay. If you can't tell, I like overlay. And soft light is practically a more subtle version of overlay. Okay, now at 100%, you can see what kind of happens. So the overlay saturates and darkens the color where it's black, and it brightens and desaturates the color where it's bright. Okay, so I want this to be much, much lower. If we turn that off, you can see for sure what's happening, the difference. I want it to be subtle. Let's try 0.5. maybe even like 0.4. Turn that on and off. Okay, very subtle touch, but often in treatment, it's better to be subtle than to be too strong. And then after this, I like to do another ellipse mask, well, actually a box mask as a vignette. So we'll add a matte box mask. Same kind of thing, we're going to blur it significantly. But I want to line it up first, just so that it borders the edge of our frame. Like this. Plug that into our blur. Just so that we're darkening the outer edges and corners. There we go, like this. All right, this will be another, I think, soft light. There we go. Nice little vignette, common photographic technique, and general image treatment technique. Keep it pretty subtle. I think that looks nice. And then how about some RGB curves? This is something I like to at least try. I don't always end up using it, but you know, it's nice to kind of tweak, like try taking the green down a little bit. Yeah, just that tiny touch kind of introduces more purple. I think that especially emulates what we saw over here. Yeah, a little bit. Maybe, you know, in the shadows, actually, instead of red, maybe we take the red down. Maybe increase the green. And that starts to look more like this image in particular. Anyway, again, I like to be subtle with this node. That's extremely subtle, but we can also change the contrast overall in the image. I don't know what in the world that little tile is. Kind of brighten the image overall. Maybe darken the dark slightly. So yeah, that looks pretty good. I don't really have definitive advice on what you need to change in the RGB curves. This comes down to personal preference, the tone of the image. Do you want the image to appear cooler or warmer or creepier, and you might want more greens? But for this situation, I'm really just trying to emulate more what I see in the reference. And going back and forth now, I'm seeing a little bit more red than I initially had. So yeah, I'm keeping it subtle, but that's kind of my guidance. I want it to end up looking similar to this as well as this one. And I think I'm kind of, you know, bridging the gap between the two right now. So I'm happy with that. But yes, it does absolutely depend on what you want for your final image. The final two elements of the composition. First is going to be a distort lens distortion node. All right, this is going to introduce just a touch of chromatic aberration, something I always do with realistic renders. And dispersion, if we put it at 0.1, we can see what's happening. It's separating the RGB channels to create a bit of a rainbow effect towards the outskirts of the image. And that's something that just happens in photographic lenses. But this is way too strong, and it's a hotly debated thing whether or not to use chromatic aberration. I still think it's part of a camera, so it needs to be in a realistic render, but do keep it subtle. So like 0.01, and if we turn that on and off, this stuff is extremely subtle. So let me kind of move this into position so you can see this is off and this is on. An extremely subtle effect, but the more you deal with renders and try and make them realistic, the more you will realize that chromatic aberration does do a lot for realism. So even that tiny little amount, I like it subtle because your eye doesn't pick up on it definitively, but there's more of a feeling about the image now that feels more photographic. And that's what I like about chromatic aberration and the lens distortion node. So I'm going to check fit, just because if you look right around the edges, it does provide a greenish red line unless you click fit, and then it kind of scales the image back out so you don't see that line. And if we reset the backdrop, all right, so we've got that lens distortion node. There's just one more thing I want to add, and that is film grain. So we will do that with an input texture, actually. And this is kind of strange, but I want to create a texture for this, but Blender expects the texture to be created in a specific context. So if I go over with the texture node selected and then click on the texture properties, the context we have to create the texture for is a brush texture, which is very unintuitive, but just don't mind that. We're not worrying about brushes, but it needs a context to create the texture. So I guess this texture node is not enough context, but we will hit the new button, and I'm going to call this film grain. And the type, I want it to be clouds, which is another name for the noise texture. I want this to be colored. I don't want it to be gray. So we'll change it to color mode, and the size needs to be much smaller, but let's first plug it in to see exactly how much smaller. Now I'm going to mix it, color, mix, and it's also going to be a soft light. And this one's a little bit more practical or scientific why I'm using soft light, because as you know, black in a soft light or overlay situation, black will saturate the image and darken it, and white will desaturate the image and brighten it. But in the gray spectrum, it will have no effect. And so with this particular texture, the majority of it will be in the gray spectrum. But then the little bit of darkness will serve really well as a film grain mixture. So let's plug that color in. And that doesn't look like film grain whatsoever because the scale needs to be significantly smaller. So in our texture properties, set the scale to 0.01, maybe 0.001. And there you go. We have some film grain. It's way too strong right now, but if we take that down to like 0.2, again, very, very subtle, maybe a little bit higher than that. 0.3, now it starts to look like a photograph. Hitting V or Alt V to zoom in, and then holding Alt and middle mouse to drag around our backdrop. Yeah, this has the elements to look like a photograph. All right, we'll reset the backdrop. Whoops, I reset the node. I need to pick that film grain again. Reset the backdrop. Okay, now we can just look at the view render and select the viewer node. If we go back and forth between render result, viewer node, you can see the difference. Subtle treatment, but when those subtle elements combine, I think we do end up with a much more photographic version of the render. We can save the image out, save as, I'll go RGB PNG image dunes number 4, and we are done with this project. Speaking of those other dunes images, what is a lot of fun about this project is each time I did a rehearsal, I got wildly different results. Here's one of the first ones. Changed the lighting, and I think it turned out way better. Then this one was kind of fun because the angle that I found in the procedural sand dunes kind of had this tall one in the middle that I was able to focus on, and you know, a different time of day, different color temperatures. So I had a lot of fun researching and developing this project. And then here's the one we did just now. So I hope you have fun with this. I look forward to seeing your results, and goodbye until next time. In this video, I want to show you how to convert the procedural displacement in your cycles shaders into real geometric displacement. So if we take this scene, for example, it comes from a recent course I did about generating procedural sand dunes. And we have the shader network on the left. And then down here, you can see that the geometry starts from a flat plane. However, if we look at the rendered view, that flat plane has become realistic sand dunes. And this kind of displaced geometry is only accessible at render time. We can't edit it as if it's a real model. But with the technique I'm about to show you, it can be converted with near perfect accuracy. But first I want to give a shout out to the CG Cookie member who discovered this technique. And it started in this thread with Emirqua, who baked out the displacement data into a regular image that achieved an okay displacement, as you can see on the right, but it's not exactly like the shader version. So there's a disconnect in the conversion. And the reason for this is that in the shader displaced version, the geometry is not only being pushed along the mesh normal, in other words, being pushed up for this flat plane, it actually is pushed out at an angle. But a regular image in the displacement modifier is not going to make this happen. And so Ian Johnson discovered a better method that results in near perfect accuracy that I'm showing you in this video. So thank you, Ian. I think a lot of people are going to find this useful. Okay, so back in Blender, the core idea of this technique is to bake out the displacement data, which is coming from this multiply node here. And in order to bake it out, I'm going to turn off our subdivision. We don't need that for this task, nor do I need it plugged into the displacement socket. Instead, let's just look at it by Shift Control clicking on it. And we can see that the data is mostly white. And the reason is because I'm multiplying the value by 15. If we take that down to 1, we get a much more clear idea of what the values look like and how they result in the sand dune shapes. However, I want this to be as accurate as possible, so I'm cranking it up to 15, which means we can no longer use 8-bit image data. As Ian discovered, we need to bake this data out using 32-bit float. So for the baking process, I need an image texture to bake to, so I'm going to add texture, image texture. Let's create a new one. I'm going to make sure that 32-bit is enabled. And since I want to maximize the accuracy of the displacement, I'm going to bake out a very large map, 8K, so 8192 by 8192. It means that the bake data will be pretty big. I'm expecting about a gigabyte for the single image, but again, it will ensure maximum accuracy. And I'm going to call this bake displacement, or just disp for short. Okay, let's create that image. And since this object started out as a plane, if I tab into edit mode, you can see that we already have the UVs laid out by default. But in order to bake, you do need UVs specified. Now that this is confirmed, I'm ready to bake. Now, some important settings. If we go to the render panel up at the top, make sure that I have cycles enabled. Sampling, I'm going to turn down to 1. Because it is pure color information, we don't need more samples than that. Also, in performance, under the tiles, make sure that this is set to the dimensions of your image. So 8192 by 8192. This will drastically reduce the bake time with cycles. And then finally, we can go to the bake settings themselves. Make sure that I am using the emit bake type. And the reason for that is, remember, I'm plugging that displacement data into an emission node via the Node Wrangler add-on. And then last thing I need to check is to make sure that my bake displacement image texture is selected. In the shader editor, go back to UV editor, and I can bake this. And there we go. It did not take long, even for such a big map. Now, when you see this color information, you might think all the details gone, it's completely washed out, but remember that that data is being saved in the 32-bit float depth. So if I save the image as an open EXR, make sure to choose 32-bit float, and I'm going to overwrite this previous version. And you can see that it is in fact a gigabyte, but it's a temporary file. As soon as we get the geometry displaced, we can delete that file. And now I can jump back into the 3D viewport. I'll pause the rendering for a second, and let's set up our modifiers. We already have a subdivision surface which comes from the project that was using adaptive subdivision. And this is where you control exactly how detailed the displacement is going to be. 4 levels is a little bit low. I recommend probably 5 or maybe even 6. Basically, if you see a sort of pixelation happening in the geometry, then you can increase that level. I'll go with 5 just for the sake of recording because level 6 does get pretty slow. So we've got 5 levels in the viewport. I'm also going to make the render levels 5 as well. And then we can add our displace modifier. And we'll need to create a new texture. I'll call this true displacement. And let's go find that in the texture properties. Let's load that file that we saved. And this really doesn't look like what we were expecting. That's because we need to set the texture coordinates to UV. And then finally make sure that our subdivision is working in the viewport. And there we go. That looks pretty good, but we want to confirm that this is in fact very close to the rendered version. So in my 3D view, if we turn off the pause button and look in the camera view, also I need to change the shader to make sure that we're seeing the principled BSDF instead of the displacement output. And I almost forgot a very important setting. Now this looks pretty good, but if you remember, the actual render did not look like this exactly. And that's because the direction here is very important. We need to change that to RGB to XYZ. Now when I select that, this looks almost identical to the shader-based displacement. So to test out the accuracy, let's go back to our render settings and update them for actually rendering, not just for baking. So 64 samples, the tiles can be 64 by 64. And then I will use GPU compute and go back to our modifiers and make sure that the subdivision is enabled for rendering. And let's render it. If I look in slot 1, this is the shader version, and then slot 2 is the geometry version. So this is the shader, and this is the geometry. You can see that it's really close, but it looks like the camera has sort of shifted. It just means that there's a slight discrepancy in the displacement values. So, I mean, we can try and get closer. I think to me, if I go back and forth, it looks like it's just a little bit stronger in the shader version. So perhaps in the strength of the displacement modifier, I can go up to like 1.1. And then let's see if that helps. Slot 2, let's render it. See the before and after. And yeah, this is really, really close. And personally, I don't care that it's not exact. Getting this accurate at all is really exciting, because now I have an actual geometric object that I can decimate, for example, and use as a game environment or something. Whatever you would need to do with an actual model. So let's add a decimate modifier, take the ratio down to 0.1. And though I skipped ahead in the video, that did take a solid like 20 to 30 seconds to calculate. Then I would convert to a mesh to essentially collapse all of my modifiers. And that actually took about 45 to 60 seconds. But at this point, I've got a true geometric version of our procedural displacement that I can edit as a mesh and do whatever I want to. It's a pretty amazing technique. I've been wanting this functionality for a while. So again, thank you, Ian. And if you want to see the entire sand dunes tutorial, you can find that on cgcookie.com.